Hi there, today I wanted to talk to you about the shift stitch, and it is kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to do my best to make it as clear as possible so that you walk away understanding what a shift stitch is and when you would need to work a shift stitch. So let me give you some context here. So shift stitches are important when you are working in continuous rounds, especially when it comes to amigurumi projects. And the shift stitch is needed because in the continuous round, we normally track the first stitch of each round. And my green stitch marker here is what I use to remind me of where my first stitch of my round is each time as I'm working in my spiral. And when we are tracking the first stitch of each round, if you are paying attention, you'll notice that in the continuous round, our first stitch, I should say, actually travels. It is moving. And I have actually shown you here with my orange stitch markers. I have marked my first stitch where it was originally, where the green stitch marker was, back down here and here and here and here. That's where my green stitch marker was when I was on those rounds. And I have marked those with the orange stitch markers to show you how my first stitch has been traveling. You can see that it is at a slant. So yes, so what that means is in our continuous rounds, our first stitch is moving. And what you can imagine with amigurumi projects, if you are told to put an arm here or a leg here and to work these features in, you might end up being on the completely wrong side of your project and you're supposed to put an arm or a leg there, and that doesn't make any sense. And that is because your first stitch for the round has actually been moving the whole time. Now, the stitch does move about every 3 to 5 rounds, and the degree of travel for that first stitch for the 3 to 5 rounds is dependent upon your gauge and the yarn that you're using. So you'll want to match your gauge as much as possible to the pattern, and see if you can also get the same or similar yarn as much as possible so that it's going to match what the designer's project is. Hopefully that made sense. Okay, so this is where shift stitches are not worked. Shift stitches are what we do to fix a traveling first stitch. And so this is what happens when you don't work shift stitches, okay? Now, here is what happens if you do make the correction to the traveling stitch. And this one I have worked shift stitches on, and I have marked here for you with my orange stitch markers. This bottom one is where my first, is where I started tracking my first stitch. And then I have worked a shift stitch, and then I marked where I worked my next shift stitch to put it back so that it is in line with my first one. And then here's where I worked another shift stitch. So it, once again, is shifted or moved. I moved my first stitch back so it is in line once again with the other stitch markers where I am keeping track of where the first stitch is, so it doesn't do this slant, okay? So here I am again, and if you're not tracking this, it'll creep up on you because, like I said, it's every 3 to 5 rounds you'll have to make the correction to the traveling first stitch. And here is how you do that. So when you have noticed that your first stitch, and like I said, it's the green stitch marker, this is where I should be starting my next round. When you've noticed that it has moved over a stitch away from where it should be, then you need to work a shift stitch, or I like to call it as move or shift your first stitch. So you're basically just telling your project, no, the first stitch is not here. My first stitch is actually going to be here. So I don't want this to start my next round there. I am going to work a shift stitch or shift my first stitch to here. That's all that means. You're just moving and telling your project that, nope, the first stitch is not going to be where you're telling me where it is now. It's going to be here. So it is now back in line with my first stitch down here. And of course, I've also marked it here for you as well when I've worked my other shift stitches. So move your stitch marker for your first stitch to where it should be, where the first stitch is always supposed to have been. Then that means now that that once had the stitch marker is now your last stitch of your round, where it wasn't actually the last, now it is. So what you're gonna do is that opened up a new stitch that isn't worked. So that is now my new last stitch, okay? And this is now my new first stitch that will start my next round. And then I just like to pay attention and track that. And what I would do now, I could probably just so since I want to track when these are moving, I would then go ahead and put this new stitch marker. Actually, here's what I would do. So here's what I do. This is my new first stitch. So I'm starting my next round. I would work my new first stitch is here, okay? And then I like to say, okay, I'm tracking this. This is my new first stitch. It's been shifted. And then I would go around, and then it's not gonna change on the next round. It's only very slight movements until finally it's a full stitch away from the original starting point. So once it gets to about over here and it's a full stitch away, that's when you're gonna shift your stitch back over to where it's supposed to be. So I hope that makes sense. So just to recap, continuous rounds, your first stitch is going to travel or move, and it's progressive. So it can go unnoticed if you're not careful, and it will make this slant. And it can disrupt where you're supposed to place features for your amigurumi projects. So to get the first stitch back in line with the original first stitch where it's supposed to be, you have to work a shift stitch, or I call it shift your first stitch. And all that it is simply move the stitch marker from your where the first stitch is marked, move it over one to where it's now in line with your original first stitch, and you're saying, now that is my first stitch now, and that's just simply shifting the beginning point of your next round. So pay attention, watch your gauge and yarn, and all that is going to impact that, but you can also just track it yourself, kind of like I do. I just place it every so often, and then when I notice when it's moved a full stitch away from where it's supposed to be, I just shift my marker over one, and then I tell my project that's where my new first stitch is supposed to be. So hopefully that helps, and you can now work your shift stitches.